Okay, great kids. Welcome back to AP World, where today it's actually Wednesday, the 18th, and we're talking about the Cold War in Vietnam. At the end of this period, you are going to owe this classwork assignment here as a Google Doc. It has a multiple choice question. Here it is. It has 3 multiple choice questions and a thesis and an introductory paragraph, so context and thesis. And in order to be able to do that, we're going to go over the Vietnam War. So let's get started. First of all, you're going to do the do now, which is, it looks like this. And it has 2 multiple choice questions. And you're going to recall what the Cold War was like in Europe and in Cuba. And once you do that, let's get going with Vietnam. So we've been learning about the Cold War, which is this 45-year beef between the USA and Soviet Union about who gets to rule the world after World War II. And we started with Europe, and then we went to Cuba last Friday. And today we're going to go to the Vietnam War, which was a huge war that lasted 21 years from 1954 to 75. We'll talk about its causes and effects and how it was fought. Here's some pictures of the Vietnam War. This is a picture that means a lot to my parents because they protested the Vietnam War back when they were in school in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so today what we're going to do is create an argument about American involvement around the world during the Cold War by examining causes and effects of the Vietnam War. So why did it happen? Was it similar to Cuba and Europe? Was it different? Was it good? Was it bad? That kind of thing. We're going to start with the background and then look at Ho Chi Minh, and then we will read some primary sources about the Vietnam War. All right, let's get started. So unlike Cuba, Vietnam was a colony before this story. So maybe you remember the age of imperialism where like India, as you can see here, was controlled by the British. China was in spheres of influence. Similarly, Vietnam was called French Indochina. It was a French colony. So it wanted to get free from French rule. And as it pushed for freedom, this leader came up to be their independence leader. And the leader's name was Ho Chi Minh. Here he is here. And as you watched in the Ed Puzzle, the capital of Vietnam is now called Ho Chi Minh City. And let's start by reading a document by Ho Chi Minh. So I'm going to go to the classwork. Yep, and there it is. Here is the rise of Ho Chi Minh. Let's take a look at what Ho Chi Minh says, and you should be able to make some connections as he says it. He says, workers, peasants, youth, students, oppressed and exploited comrades. So already when I'm reading that, I'm thinking, who is Ho Chi Minh talking to? The Communist Party of Indochina is founded. It is the party of the working class. It will help the working class lead the revolution in order to struggle for all the oppressed and exploited people. From now on, we must love the party, help it, and follow it in order to implement the following slogans. And you can read what he writes here. Okay, so that's a little bit on Ho Chi Minh, and he's a total hero of the Vietnamese for overthrowing the French and then sticking it to the Americans. And you can see he's a product of a global network. He studied communism in Paris. So he's part of a global network. And he's a nationalist, but he's also a communist. He's the leader of the North Vietnamese Viet Minh Communist Party. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background of Vietnam, where they're a French colony with communist leanings. And then we get to the United States, and the United States at this time was nervous about something called the domino theory. And you can read that to yourself. And you can see this diagram where they feared that if these countries would fall to communism, then all of them would fall to communism. Now, last week we read the Truman Doctrine that said that it's America's job to stop communism. So you can imagine that the USA is going to be involved in Vietnam. Now, they can't get super involved. And the reason they can't get super involved is because of the fear of nuclear war. So what the USA did was they supported the South Vietnamese in fighting against the communist North Vietnamese. And over time, this developed into a really big proxy war. A proxy war, as you can read there, is a conflict between two states that act on behalf of other parties. So in this case, South Vietnam was acting on behalf of the United States, and North Vietnam was acting on behalf of the Soviets. And both sides were armed by the bigger powers. The USA armed the South Vietnamese, and the Soviets armed the North Vietnamese, which you can see in this picture right here. You can also see over time that in the 1960s, more and more Americans went to Vietnam, where in 1968-69, 500,000 American men went to Vietnam. And the war went on for 15, 20 years. And at the end of it, Ho Chi Minh won. And the USA had to leave. And America was totally distraught over their inability to stop communism in Vietnam. And Vietnam became a communist country. And today, Vietnam technically is still a communist country. At the end of this day, 58,000 Americans died in the war, and their names are commemorated on the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C., whereas about 1.5 million or 2 million Vietnamese died, which is a terrible story. And you can probably build some connections to other places that the USA has done some work in. So that's about the end of the story. If we were in class, I'd ask you to maybe compare the Vietnam and Cuba story. And what I'm going to ask you to do now is do some readings about the Vietnam War. And there are 3 documents in the readings. Let's find them. Get me out of this pen. So the 3 documents are about napalm, which is a substance that creates this kind of explosion, guerrilla warfare, and this document here by John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama. And you're going to read about their feelings on the Vietnam War and about the My Lai massacre. And after you do that, I want you to think about what you learned about Vietnam and create a thesis and a context in this classwork. Okay? Just to go back to the PowerPoint to close, I think we have some ending vocab. And if you want to go here, there's a cool video from Woodstock in 1969, the protest of the Vietnam War. Oh, maybe not. But we could YouTube it. Country fish, Vietnam. So that's what it was like in the 60s in America. Okay, I'm going to end my screen share there, and I'll post this on Google Classroom tomorrow. I look forward to reading your intros. Okay, feel free to holler at me if stuff doesn't make sense.